Nosotros venceremos. We will win. This was a statement by Cesar Chavez in an outcry for national farm worker rights. Over 100 years after the end of slavery, Hispanic and Filipino farm workers in Southern California faced conditions that mirrored that of slaves. In a bold step, on September 9, 1965, Filipino farm workers laid down their grapes on Delano fields and went on strike because of their poor conditions and treatment by growers. Their conditions were recognized by organizers like Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, and Larry Itliong, who led their efforts and expanded the strike into a boycott for civil rights, with over 17 million Americans in protest by 1970. The over half-a-decade strike, known as the Delano Grape Strike, turned the tide for farm workers across the United States and for Filipino and Hispanic Americans seeking recognized rights in their work and in their country. The Delano Grape Strike became a turning point for migrant civil rights and an introduction to a wave of protests that would revolutionize the American farm working industry. By the late 1920s, 75% of farm workers in California were Hispanic or Filipino. Racism persisted throughout this time, driving the saturation of American fields and locking migrant generations in toil and poverty. Receiving slave pay well under minimum wage, often 70 cents per hour, grape workers lived in camps owned by the growers, often living in sheds, with their children going malnourished and uneducated. Thousands of farmers did not have access to medical insurance or Social Security, leaving the elderly farm workers defenseless against disease. Their homes often faced the weather of the Coachella Valley, with many only having tin roofs and dirt floors. The conditions that thousands of farm workers faced were disregarded in fear of brutality from the growers and the field owners. Many faced the threats of physical and verbal abuse, with some growers using pesticide spray to punish the workers. The risk of deportation imprisoned the farm workers to face those conditions with a severe disenfranchisement in the land of the free.
Particularly when they work all summer long, keep the richest agricultural state in the country afloat. And then after summer's gone, they're asked to leave these camps and to move on. The whole system kind of encourages migrant life of the farm worker.
Oh, they were horrendous. I mean, and not only were they not paid very much money, they didn't have any type of unemployment insurance that all industrial workers have. No. But I think the most terrible thing about their condition was that the employers did not respect their workers enough. They were denigrated and insulted.
The woman describing these horrible conditions was Dolores Huerta. Born in New Mexico in 1930 to a Hispanic miner and farm worker, she became inspired by her mother's activism in her community, and Huerta aspired to follow in her footsteps. Despite facing academic racism, Huerta persisted and began teaching in 1950. After seeing her farm worker-raised students come in hungry, she recognized the maltreatment of Hispanics in her area. She became one of the most influential civil rights leaders of the century, and her participation with Cesar Chavez in the creation of the National Agricultural Workers Union revolutionized women's participation in protests. Enter Cesar Chavez, a migrant worker from Arizona who experienced the Californian fields and called to action the National Farm Workers Association, along with Dolores Huerta, to carry out the Hispanic strike forming alongside the Filipino Delano Grape Strike. Cesar Chavez worked tirelessly to organize protests, lead marches, attend meetings, and talk with leaders and officials to enact change. In this historical turning point, workers laid down their grapes on September 9, 1965, led by Larry Itliong, and at a high price, but for the hope of a better future, not only for themselves as the workers, but for their children and generations to come. Larry Itliong was a Filipino immigrant and activist leader who saw firsthand the unjust conditions of the farm workers and immigrants in Delano. He formed the Filipino Farm Labor Union in 1965, and he collaborated with Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta to merge the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee to form the United Farm Workers Union. The United Farm Workers Union would be the leading union in the Delano Grape Strike, an organization that still actively fights for labor and civil rights today. After this stunt on September 12th, the grape field owners tried numerous efforts to turn the Filipinos against the Mexicans who were having talks about going on strike as well. 3 days later, Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, and Larry Itliong held a meeting in the National Farm Workers Union headquarters in Delano. A unanimous vote between the union members to merge the two groups and establish the United Farm Workers Union, officially beginning the Delano Grape Strike. the UFW demanded higher pay and protection for workers, such as medical insurance and Social Security. They demanded Filipino and Hispanics be recognized as Americans. Their efforts would revolutionize civil rights for migrants. The strike lasted over 5 years in some areas. Corporations such as the Southern Pacific Railroad, DiGiorgio, and Kern County landowners owned much of the lands in Delano, hosting the unfair conditions that the farmers were subjected to. Chavez, Horta, and Leong knew it would take more than changing company policy to make a lasting impact. Chavez met with many political figures such as Robert F. Kennedy to garner media attention to the strike. Horta organized 144 farm workers to visit cities across the United States to promote the strike and boycott of grapes across America in support of the farm workers. The UFW sponsored these efforts and led millions across the United States to begin to notice the treatment of the men and women who grew their food. Chavez enacted one of the most significant and impactful movements within the strike in the months to follow. He organized a plan to march with thousands of farm workers on a strike to Sacramento, a trek that would last over 300 miles across California. Strikers marched from Delano to Sacramento, California's capital, to meet these demands and protests. Strikers could be found singing and chanting, picking up more workers and grape fields along the path, adding more and more statewide support for the strike.
Look, there's music, there's people out there, and they know we're coming, and they were playing music, and that lifted us a lot. That helped us a lot. They gave us más ánimo to march more.
Upon arrival in Sacramento, over 10,000 supporters gathered in front of the state's capital with a protest led by Chavez, urging politicians to recognize the mistreatment. Chavez fasted for 24 days during the march, a symbol of his true resolve towards farm worker rights. The hunger strike attracted more media attention, sparking national news. He met with the governor of California at this time, breaking his fast next to Robert F. Kennedy, eating a single piece of bread with him. This effort led to a discussion on legislation for protection of workers to be passed locally, but it mainly led to the popularization of the strike nationally. Within the state, boycotts on grapes skyrocketed, with some Los Angeles cargo freights refusing to ship the grapes, leaving them to rot in ports. Boycotts around the United States ballooned to a participation of over 17 million Americans. Chavez and Horta continued their influence while the strike continued. In 1966, Cesar Chavez sat in front of the U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Migratory Labor to represent farm workers across America. He spoke on the imperativeness for farm workers to be recognized as citizens under the law. In 1970, the growers on DiGiorgio land signed the first official labor contracts with the UFW, and the strike on grapes was officially concluded on DiGiorgio land. These signages led to other growers to sign on protection policies as well. The boycott led to over 17 million Americans participating in the protest by 1970. The Delano grape strike revolutionized the way Filipinos and Hispanics were recognized in America, their civil rights being shaped by their efforts. Horta and Chavez's work remains today, supporting farm workers across the United States through charity and farming resources. The UFW supports Hispanic and Filipino migrants and brings issues to local and federal courts. The 20-worker strike on September 9, 1965 is the mark of one of the greatest civil rights and social justice movements of the century. The strikers who participated persevered for 5 grueling years in hopes for a change for themselves and for their children. The Delano grape strike introduced Hispanic and Filipino farm workers as citizens who would be equally protected underneath the law. It not only revolutionized the farm working industry and agribusiness across the United States, but it also introduced a form of protesting to the century that would be used in a fight for justice and other strikes, such as the California lettuce strike and the Campbell soup strike. Cesar Chavez and Dolores Horta have went on to receive medals of honor for their contributions to social justice, as well as pioneers for Filipino and Hispanic immigrants who claimed their rights and rights for all. The strike secured the blessings of liberty to these immigrants, rights and recognition that they would endow to their children through a fight for justice and a hope for a better future.